We're beginning a new series on how to become an overcomer in life, how to overcome the unexpected twists and turns and obstacles and challenges that come our way as human beings. And to do that, I'd like us to look at the life of a man by the name of David. We have this rich heritage of people who have gone before us from generation to generation to generation. And they can be sort of travel guides to us to help us navigate the things that we go through in our lives. And when they do that, they bring an enormous amount of wisdom and understanding and perspective to who we are as people. And they pass this along to us. David passes along to us, to you and me, certain guiding principles about how to be overcomers in our life. But before we move on to the life of David, let me share a personal story with you. It's my experience that the firstborn child in my life, my first son, was an amazing experience. Who can but rejoice at so great a gift from the hand of God? The birth of a child just brings us into the very presence of God. And so there's this special relationship that develops between a father and a firstborn child. And I had made a commitment that every night when I would put this little boy to bed, that I would give him a look, a word, and a touch. I would touch him. I would look deeply into his eyes, and then I would give him some kind of word. And the word that I would give him was that if I ever lost you, I would line up every single kid in the whole wide world, and I would go down that line one kid at a time until I found you. Because I didn't want him to spend 1 ounce of emotional energy wondering if he was loved or if I loved him. So I'd line up all these kids. I'd go down them one kid at a time until I found you. I'd tell him that every single night, a look, a word, and a touch. When he graduated from graduate school, he gave me this little 3x5 envelope with a card in it. And when I went back to the hotel room after the graduation, I opened up the envelope and pulled the card out, and I read it. And it said, "Dear Dad, if I ever lost you, I would line up every single dad in the whole world, and I would go down that line one dad at a time until I found you." And I thought, he got it. The power of passing along certain values, a look, a word, a touch, guidelines, principles, relationships. The passing along of these kinds of things are very, very important to us as human beings. And this is what the Bible does. It passes along the wisdom, the insights, the principles, the life stories of great people and a very, very unknown people that we can learn from so that we don't have to navigate life on our own. Christianity is not a solo sport. No one would ever attempt to climb Mount Everest alone. We have this host of people around us to give us the power of passing along from generation to generation to generation. And I want to look at the life of David as he passes along the power to overcome in his life and passes it along to our lives. And you might want to carve out some time to each week to listen to one of these messages. Maybe it's a Sunday morning. Maybe you want to listen to one or two at a time. I think you're going to find there's some power in what David passes along to us, generation to generation to generation, of becoming an overcomer. And that's why we have these kinds of series, becoming an overcomer, that God wants us to overcome the obstacles, the challenges, the tests in our lives. Now, sometimes there are not always good endings to things. Sometimes things are hard, but on the inside, where it really counts, God says, I will grow you. I will develop you. I will make you a better person. I will give you a bigger and better perspective on life. That is what overcoming is. It's growing. It's releasing the bondage of things that hold us back and moving forward into transformational new life in our lives. And I hope that this series will do that for you. So let's look at the life of David and see how he became an overcomer. Now, he is one of the most significant men who has ever lived. To this day, people still read his books and study his life. He is the central figure of the Old Testament. There's more written about David than Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. Jesus was referred to as the son of David. And to this day, his star flies on the flag of Israel. So who is this man, David? Well, the first thing we need to know about him is that he came out of nowhere. Absolute nowhere. He was a shepherd boy. He was tending the flocks of the family business when God called him to his ministry. Yet he ended up moving from being a simple shepherd to having more power and more money and more status and more fame than you could possibly imagine. But David found the meaning and the purpose and the direction in his life in his relationship and in his heart for God. And in so doing, he becomes an overcomer and passes on those principles to you and me to this very day. So let's look at some of the marks that define the life of this man who came from nowhere. The first thing we notice about David, this man who came out of nowhere, is that he is a great military leader and genius. At a very early age, he takes out the reigning world heavyweight champion, a man by the name of Goliath, with a single knockout punch. When Saul the king heard that David wanted to fight this giant in the valley, and we're going to look at this in the next two messages, and I definitely want you to tune into that. But when Saul said, "How do you, a little shepherd boy, suppose that you can overcome this great giant? Walk into the valley of your fears." David said, "You just said it, Saul. I'm a shepherd boy. I make my living killing lions and bears. I sacrifice my life for my sheep. And every single time, God has protected me." Early on in David's life, he formed together 400 high-voltage warriors that could strike with strategic power at any objective that they decided to overcome. Over time, those 400 men who were like Navy SEALs grew to 4,000 and then to tens of thousands of men in David's army. They would rather fight for David and die for David than to live without him. They loved his courage and his passion and his heart. And David says, "I learned all of this in the fields as a shepherd in the wilderness. God taught me how to become an overcomer." So when you see me as this great military leader and genius, you have to understand, I have a past that God led me through, a past in which God was teaching me day by day by day to become an overcomer. The second thing we notice about David and his becoming an overcomer, and this one might catch you by surprise, but I think it's an important one, is that David was a world-class musician and poet. When it came to music, he was a child prodigy. At a very early age, Saul the king, who was going through this Anfechtung and these existential periods of panic and anguish, would call David, the shepherd boy, to come and sing to him and play for him of his music and his poetry to comfort him. There's something unique that happens with music. It connects our inner circles, our inner core. It affects our feelings. Music can change my emotions in a heartbeat. I can hear the right song come on the radio and it just lifts my spirits and I start to sing along with it. Or I can hear something that's soft and quiet and it settles me. David had that world-class child prodigy ability. Luther said that music connects us, our hearts in here with God, and music connects our hearts in here with each other. So there's this triangle that takes place when we worship together, and music does something to our emotions and our feelings. It lifts us, it inspires us, it unites us together. And in the context of his music, David also put words to that music. He was the poet laureate of Israel. His book of Psalms is the greatest book of spiritual writing that's ever been written. It's been read by more people than any other book. It's unparalleled in its emotional depth and its ability to capture our hearts and our minds. Oftentimes, I'm called to be at the bedside when somebody is spending their last days or hours or moments here on planet Earth. And I always bring my Bible and I read to them the Psalms. Sometimes the family is gathered together and I just say, absorb. Let these Psalms sink in. Even if a person is unconscious, I believe they hear the words of the sweet psalmist of Israel. There's nothing like the Psalms. The 23rd Psalm, Psalm 3, Psalm 48, Psalm 51. They soothe our souls. They minister to our inner spirits. And this is very important when it comes to becoming an overcomer, that overcoming is not just taking on challenges out there, but it's getting ourselves right in here. It's ministering to the inner core, to the inner circle of our lives. And God gave David the ability through his music. When David was going through the troubles that he went through, he would sing and he would write poetry and it would minister to him and it would help him keep on firm footing so that he could become an overcomer. When he was in the caves of En-Gedi, hiding from the forces of Saul, he wrote Psalm 3, Thou, O Lord. He immediately takes his perspective away from himself and away from his troubles, and he turns them to God. Thou, O Lord, are a shield about me. That word shield is not just a shield that a soldier carries. In the Hebrew, it means a 360-degree wall around me that cannot be penetrated. Thou, O Lord, art this wall around me. You're my glory, the kavod, the heaviness, the weightiness, the firm foothold of my life. You are the lifter of my head. That when somebody is down and beaten, that God, thou, O Lord, comes and you lift my head towards the heavens. You see, don't forget the inward, the emotional part of life when it comes to overcoming, and see how God used this emotional gift that he gave him for David to become an overcomer and to pass along those principles in his book of Psalms to you and me to this day. It's the power of passing along. There's a third area that marks David's life in which God taught him to become an overcomer. David becomes famous for his fallenness and his sinfulness. When he was 30 years old, David became the king of all Israel. He ushered in the golden age of Israel. He expanded the borders, built trade routes, built great palaces and great cities. He had enormous wealth. To this day, they refer to David in Israel as the king. When you're talking about the kings of Israel, and there were many, when people say the king, they're referring to David. And then at the height of his career, his story takes a tragic turn. It's the spring of the year when the armies go into battle and when kings lead their armies into battle. You see, when the winter came, the armies would call a truce because the roads were muddy and they were sloppy, and they would re-engage again back in the spring when the roads dried out. And so every spring, the kings would lead their armies into battle. Only this year, David stayed back. He stayed home. And there was a reason why he stayed home. He had become obsessed with a young woman. He had to have her. And he did. And what makes matters even worse is that he abused his authority, and to cover up this whole thing, he killed her husband by putting him into battle in the front lines, fighting for King David. Well, over time, this scandal, and it was over time, we're going to look at this message and story in great detail of overcoming failure in relationships, of what happens when things get broken in our lives. But over time, that scandal hit the front pages of every newspaper in Palestine. He was publicly disgraced. He was personally humiliated. And he learned some lessons about failure and how to overcome failure the hard way. The really, really, really hard way. And it's in his failure that David teaches us how to become overcomers. He writes one of the most beautiful prayers of repentance ever written in Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy steadfast love. According to thy abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquities and cleanse me from my sin. He's appealing to a God of mercy and steadfast love. And he asks God to eliminate, erase, to blot out his sinfulness and his fallenness. And then not only that, but on the inside, again, in the inner core, he teaches us how to overcome the guilt and the pain that's stored up on the inside. And he says, cleanse me in here, in the inside, from all unrighteousness. David is famous for his fallenness and his sinfulness, and he's also famous for how he overcomes that fallenness and sinfulness in his life. There's a fourth mark of David's life. David was a broken-hearted father. You know how the story goes. There's this birth of this child. There's the care, the nurturing, the encouraging, the training, the mentoring. But over time, David's relationship with his son Absalom became estranged. They had words. They got angry with each other. Over time, Absalom rejected David and ultimately tried to take over his kingdom. He became his greatest rival, his greatest enemy, his greatest challenge in life. Well, one day, while the son was in battle fighting for Israel, one of David's chief commanding officers found him alone, and he actually had him killed. And he raced back to Jerusalem, to the palace, to the courtroom of David, to tell him the good news that his greatest challenge in life, his greatest adversary in life, his son Absalom, was now dead and no longer a threat to David. But David's response was not one of joy. He loved Absalom. He cared for him. He raised him. He held him when he was a young child. He was brokenhearted. He had that brokenheartedness that only a father can know. We find these words in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33. When David gets the news, Samuel records his response. It's a response only a broken-hearted father can know. Oh, my son, Absalom. My son. My son. Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son. O Absalom, my son, my son. It was in his brokenness, it was in his grief, it was in his failure that David learned to overcome in his life. And he teaches us and passes along from generation to generation to generation how to do that. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at how he does this. And interestingly, God provided a restoration for him, a new child in his life. He had another son, and that son's name was Solomon, and he became the wisest man that the world had known. Well, there's a fifth and final mark. David was known for his heart after God. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, these words. For the Lord, that is God, does not see man as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart and here, who we are inside, when no one is looking, when we're alone, when it's just us, you and me, and God. And for David, he knew one thing. Only one thing mattered to him, one goal, one destiny, one mountain peak, is that he had a fully invested, passionate heart for God. Now, that's not that David didn't make mistakes. David was a real human being living in a real world with real people and real problems and real failures, real fallenness and real brokenness. He knew what it was like to have success, and knew what it was like to end up on his knees before his God in failure when life unravels and it's broken. But here's what David knew. David knew that he could fail God. And he would fail God. But God would never fail him. He knew that his hands were in the life of God. And that over time, God would speak to him and lead him and prompt him, and that he would always be able to overcome and prevail whatever it was that life threw its way. You see, from a human perspective, life gets complex, it gets difficult, it gets multi-dimensional, multi-layered. Sometimes we wonder, God, what are you doing? We want plans, we want direction, we want to know the outcome, we want to know the end, we want to know that everything's going to be okay, but God doesn't work that way. God doesn't work in straight lines. God works in God's line. It's what we call the doctrine of the providence of God. I refer to it throughout this series. That the writer of Hebrews says, walk by faith and not by sight, because sometimes our sight is not correct. It does not give us an accurate reading of reality. We have a limited, finite vantage point. So it says, walk by faith, not by sight. That is our faith in God. Because God has an unlimited, eternal vantage point, and he's willing over time to share that vantage point with us finite human beings. This is a theme of the life of David, which we're going to repeat over and over and over again. It's the doctrine of the providence of God. And in that providence of God, God says if you want to become an overcomer in life, you'll need to learn to walk by faith. Faith in your heart, that you have a fully invested heart in me, and you follow that heart as it walks in faith with me. The starting point of all overcoming in life is a heart that's fully invested in God, that walks by faith in relationship with him. Now again, by overcoming, it doesn't mean that life is going to always turn out right out there. It means that life is always going to turn out right in here, where God is working and active and alive and teaches us how to withstand any challenge and stand against any storm and any hurricane that life throws our way. We have that assurance that we will prevail. And so the distinguishing mark of David in his life is that he always ended up in the right place before God, on his knees, seeking God, in a heart of faith that was totally sold out, passionate about who was God is. This is the starting point of becoming an overcomer. And I would ask you and me in this message, I would ask you, where is your heart? What is the highest passion of your heart? What is it that moves you and guides you and directs you and gets you up out of bed in the morning and says, I'm sold out to this. I'm all in. I'll give my life to this. I could sacrifice to this. And this is where I want to be. On my knees, humbly approaching him in his way and in his time. So this is what this message series is going to be about. I can't wait for you to dig into this story of David overcoming his fears in his life and teaching us, passing along from generation to generation to generation, a word, a look, a touch of how that can happen in your life and my life, right smack dab in the middle of our modern day world.